Christian educational class. We're beginning here at chapter 4 of Moses. Moses, the lawgiver. Moses, the author. He is the author of the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Within those 40 years of his life, just like those 40 days, Moses was a busy man. But in these 40 days, as he was dealing with this new generation of Israel, his whole aim was to exhort, to encourage the new generation, the ones who were making a shift, the ones who were making a shift. This is what he said: only be careful and never forget what you yourselves have seen. Do not let these memories escape from your mind. As long as you live, and be sure to pass them on to your children and grandchildren. This is found in Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, in the 9th verse. Moses exhorts the new generation through history, through his story, the experience of their fathers, the experience that they had 40 years ago. He referred to the great miracles of God's goodness, the great miracles of God's provision, and God's judgment against their parents' unbelief and their complaining. He also sums it up in chapter 4, their encounter with God at Mount Sinai. That encounter had a specific meaning. God was not flexing his muscles. Listen to me carefully. He was showing that he don't have muscles. The nation of Israel heard God speak at this mountain. Their fathers received God's 10 commandments, the thou shalt nots. It would include the promises to bless obedience. It would include the promises to bless obedience and the promises to curse disobedience. This is why God showed Israel that he had no muscles. At the mountain, they saw no image, but he spoke out of the midst of fire. He warned your fathers against idolatry. Against idolatry. For that would become their father's temptation, to create muscles, to create a head, to create an arm, to create an image, and say that this is their God. But their God was a voice that spoke through the fire. Exhort your fathers to teach you. He exhorted their fathers to teach you so that you can teach your children and have life in the land of Canaan. Moses wanted the new generation to realize that God valued that they themselves and that their family live, have life instead of fun, have life instead of excitement. Have life. Have life instead of pleasure. I hope you can hear Moses. He wasn't even talking about eternal life, but he wanted babies to become grown people. And he wanted grown people to become old people. He wanted them to know life in Canaan. But history teaches that your fathers had no faith in God. They would not enter the land of Canaan on his command. Unbelief was your father's sin. Unbelief was your father's sin. But Moses exhorted the new generation, take heed to yourselves as you enter into the promised land. Do not forget the covenant of the Lord. For remember what your fathers experienced. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Moses, being a prophet, foresaw the future of the new generation, that their sin will be idolatry also. So he challenged the new generation that when the shift is made, when you step out of somebody else's land and begin to enter into your land, take heed to yourself. You can find this all, if you would take time, I beg you, to read Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, the 9th through the 10th verse. Well, God, through Moses, was striving to bless the new generation to know, or already know, the sin that would trip you up. And if you believe what I am saying, you will overcome it. Now listen. Moses not only was an author, Moses not only was a leader, but he was an example. He was an example. Now listen to this, because he wasn't an example of the blessings. He wasn't the examples of the promise of the blessings, but he was an example of the promise of the curse. Furthermore, the Lord was angry with me for your sakes, and sworn that I will not, the author, the prophet, Moses, cross over the Jordan, and that I will not enter the good land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. But I must die in this land. I must not cross over the Jordan, but you shall cross over and possess the good land. With conviction, with empathy, he pleaded with the new generation, take heed that you yield not to temptation. His testimony, this was his testimony. He was evidence that sin angers God. That sin angers God. All that he said about their fathers from Egypt to the border of Canaan was true. For he did not blame God, Moses, nor did he blame the people. But he said, the Lord was angry with me. Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, the 21st through the 24th verse. Please read. Moses strongly pleaded with the new Israel. The only wise God is holy, is just, but he is a God of mercy. The prophet said, the Lord will scatter you among the peoples because of your idolatry. Listen, this prophecy gave Moses some type of relief, because he told it as though it was going to happen the next day. But he foresaw that this prophecy of them falling away from serving the true and living God was going to happen 550 years later, it gave the teacher, it gave the author some consolation that his laboring at the border for 40 days was not in vain. I hope y'all can hear me today, because he saw that this actually happened 550 years later. But he exhorted that God will not totally abandon Israel, for they are the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prodigals, patriarchs that God made promises to, and he will not take them back. Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, the 27th through the 28th verse. Please read. But from there, you will seek the Lord your God in the land of Babylon. You will find him if you seek him with all your heart, with all your soul. When you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. Deuteronomy, 4th chapter, the 29th through the 31st verse. This great man of God desired that the new generation would consider who God is. Therefore, know this day and consider it in your heart that the Lord himself is God, of heaven above and of earth beneath. There is no other. There is no second. There is no third. There is no 551 gods. He is the only wise God. You shall keep his statutes and commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you. And this is the catch, so that this generation would know God is not against children, and that your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land. God never meant for man, his wife, his children to have short life. It was never God's will that a teenager die at the age of 16. It was never God's will that a baby die at the age of infancy. God wanted man to enjoy life, but sin is the robber. Prolong your days in the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. You'll find this in Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, the 39th through the 40th verse. Please read it. Please read it, especially if you're raising a child or you're raising children. Please read it. Please read it. God is still singing. God is still singing. Please read Zephaniah, the 3rd chapter and the 17th verse. As I come to the close of this. You have seen good. You have seen bad. You've been hurt beyond pain. But just remember that better days are coming. Our next lesson is the continuation of Moses' exhortation. The continuation that the generation would teach the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And according to the prophecy, they at least did it for 550 years. To earnestly attempt to encourage the new generation of Israel to Shema, to Shema, to Shema. English-speaking saints, that means pay attention. Deuteronomy, 4th chapter, the 32nd through the 49th verse. Our next class, Shema.